We're on the downward stretch now. This is going to be a really exciting session. So I can't see Euan, which is slightly panicking me.
No, I'm here.
Are you? Great. So welcome, Euan, who is a GP, but also is editor of BJGP, and that's why he's here today. We're going to do an Ask the Editor session. We've got some questions, but if anybody else has got any questions, they can replace our pre-prepared questions, so do put them in the chat. And I will try and keep an eye out for those, but I'm sure other people will help. So, Euan, welcome, and thank you for giving up your time, and thank you for agreeing to record this session. So, first of all, can you just give us a clue as to the sort of audience that BJGP and BJGP Open is aimed at?
Yeah, sure. It's actually quite a challenging question to start with, I think, because of the facets of the journal. What I wanted to say first, before we go any further, is I hope that the aim is really that I can maybe just, well, my aim generally as editor is to try and pull back the curtain with the BJGP so that people understand a little bit more about how we work. And of course, I hope that will mean that you understand a little bit better how journals work generally. So it can be a bit of a pain point getting published. And we're very aware of that pain point for people, and just understanding the kind of what happens to when the manuscripts disappear after you send them off via the submission system. So I hope that we can maybe, if you any questions around that, feel free to ask me anything, and I'll give as honest an answer as I can without incriminating anyone as much as possible. In terms of our audience then, I think that is a difficult one because we do publish academic research, obviously, and that's clearly aimed at anyone for whatever reason who's reviewing the evidence around that subject: clinicians, academics, journalists, members of the public, anybody, you know, bloggers sitting in their underpants writing about a topic will access our papers and write about them. And we've got the archive going back to the 1960s on bjgp.org, and it gets several million downloads a year from various papers. So obviously one of our audiences is very clearly the people that access the papers and use them to write, you know, whatever they're doing, whether they're writing editorials or whether they're writing papers of their own or whether they're doing systematic reviews. And that's a big one. And I think it's probably worth pointing out, the question maybe more nuanced is about who's the kind of what papers are more likely to fit with BJGP's ethos, I suppose, as well. And I guess we are tilted towards, we have to be selective, unfortunately, at the journal, or the way that we're set up currently. And when we get last year in 2020, there were something like 829 articles, research articles that were submitted. And we could only publish perhaps about 100 or 110 of those. So our overall, in terms of, now a lot of those get culled fairly immediately for various reasons, but that does mean that we still have a lot of very high quality papers that we have to turn away. And so one of the things I always like to get across to people is that if you think that you're the audience for the BJGP, or the kind of paper should be published there, actually, unfortunately, there is quite a number that we can't take. There are often still very high quality papers that absolutely deserve to be published somewhere, but just aren't quite right for us for various reasons. And we tend to tilt towards, because we can be selective, we probably go more for practice changing or policy changing research where possible, and tend towards a little bit towards novelty, though one has to be careful of that because replicability is obviously so important as well in science. So that's kind of on the research side. We also publish, of course, editorials, clinical practice articles. We have our website, bjgplife.com, where we publish a lot of opinion and comment. So I think, and we've got a podcast, so I think with those, we're trying to reach much further into the primary care community. And I think that's around whether it's clinical, whether it's policy, whether it's research, all the gaps in between, whether it's patient advocacy, kind of with a scholarly approach, I would like to think as well as part of that. But that encompasses an awful lot. So the audience we're aimed at is fairly substantial, and it depends which niche you look at and which particular bit that you're at any given moment you're interested in.
Sorry, I was on mute. So if you've got a paper that you're not completely sure about, would you suggest that we contact you first for your advice?
Yeah, I think, my standard, I don't quite have this on a snippet that I cut and paste in, but one of the things I'm very keen on as the editor is to try to present a human face to the journal as well, because I think particularly in some journals, some of the way that the models of the open access journals in the bigger kind of and Biomed Central springs to mind, and I've been an editor-in-chief of Biomed Central as well, is that actually it's quite hard to know that there's people running it. And there are people there that are running it, but a lot of it's automated and a lot of it is outsourced as well. The way that the manuscripts certainly are edited once they are accepted. So I'll try to give a personal response if you do ask me, and I'm very happy to take, I handle lots of emails every week, but people asking me about papers. My standard line is it's very hard to know until you see the full paper. So that's always the caveat I always ask, but I will try and guide people because sometimes you're not sure whether a paper is a bit on the margins for us. What we do is now we do have to, and it's a painful phrase, but we do have to desk reject some papers and we don't send them for peer review. And we like to think that that's a mercy insofar as if we send stuff for peer review, it can disappear for, like, sometimes people are very busy, peer reviewers, it's a lot of pressure on their time, and it takes a little bit of time for peer review to come back. We're generally quite quick, but you're looking at a month or two, by and large, before you get a peer review back. I mean, if we're fortunate, sometimes it comes back much, much quicker than that. But by the time you go through a few people, particularly in COVID times, it's taken a wee while to get peer review back. It's been, I think we're seeing some improvement now, actually, that maybe the kind of the pressure is lifting just a little, certainly by the measures of the peer review. Anyway, I digress. What were we done now? Now I've digressed. I forgot what I was.
Should we contact you first?
Yes.
The message is
so
yes.
So we don't. So the dreaded desk reject. And the problem with the desk reject is, if we wait a month or two and reject you, that's a real waste of your time. And actually, if we can reject relatively quickly and say this is not right for us, and actually it's not going to be worth sending for peer review because your chances of acceptance are really very minimal. Actually, although you'll get the feedback from the peer review, actually you're better off going somewhere else where you've got a reasonable chance of success. So I'll try and guide people in that initial email if you contact me, and I'm very happy to do so. But if we're not sure, I will often say we need to see the full paper, but then it's very rarely longer than a week if we're going to desk reject a paper. And it's looked at by myself, it's looked at by one of the associate editors. And so we get a couple of pairs of eyes reading it, and then we make a decision. If we're not sure, we talk about it amongst ourselves as an editorial group as well, usually by electronically, but though we have regular meetings as well. But we'll try to give a quick response if we really think it's not going to work. So even if you don't lose too much, now there's probably an important bit that's worth adding here, that actually some of the pain of sending into journals is the fact that you have to format them for each individual journal, and they've all got their particular little wrinkles. So we are moving rapidly now at the BJGP. We've written the policy and we're just trying to work out the wrinkles, because it always upsets the workflow a little, of moving towards a format-free process, so that we're not going to expect you to tick all the boxes when you first submit in terms of providing all the little sections that we want and it laid out exactly as the finished article was going to look, in terms of the way that it's probably not fair it's probably a slight misnomer to call it format free, and a lot of journals are moving towards this. It's probably format light, or format generic is a better way of putting it, because you still expect introduction, methods, results, and discussion, but we're not expecting all the other little bits in between, and we're trying to strip away some of the pain of submitting, because sometimes we know that some papers come in, they go to Margaret, who's our incredibly capable assistant who looks after them, and then you have to make changes to make them acceptable to go forward to the editors. That's a lot of work, and then we bounce them back to you in 2 days, desk rejecting them. And I can't imagine anything that would cheese me off more. And we're quite keen to actually do what we can to reduce that particular pain point as well. So I think there's quite a lot bundled up in that answer, but I think I've kind of tried to give a feel for the processes. And that we're very aware that we don't want you to put unnecessary time and effort into something which is not going to work. Equally, we're very keen to have the chance to see papers and consider whether they could work for us as well.
I mean, that's really helpful. I think the format light approach will be very well received by people on this call today. So another question is, how important is the cover letter? Is it a formality, or is it really a chance for the authors to sell their paper to you?
Again, a question that I will try not to spend too long answering. It's an interesting point, because I think when I've been asked this in the past, it hadn't occurred to me that actually people would be uncertain about it, which is a good example of why pulling back the curtain is kind of a good approach. I think that we can have these conversations about what works and what doesn't work. I think it's possible to, of course we read them. I think I'm glad I've answered the format light bit first, because I think the cover letter could become more important as we go to a format light approach. I wouldn't spend, the thing is, to write a good cover letter is a tremendous amount of time. You know, it isn't easy to write something like that. And there is a strong argument that if I and the associate editors can't work out what the strengths of the paper are from the paper, there's an argument that the paper hasn't been quite written right in some ways, that we should be able to tell from the way it's written. In terms of the introduction will give us the essential background, the discussion gives us the strengths of the paper, limitations, and how it fits in as well. So I wouldn't want people to invest an enormous amount of time in it, because I think that time would be better spent getting your manuscript sorted out and really up to speed. I think if there are sort of wider considerations that don't necessarily fit into the paper itself, perhaps around policy, or things that are forthcoming which are a little bit more speculative, I think that's probably worth putting in and giving us that context. That could be helpful as well. It is possible to sandbag yourself a little bit on this as well. We've we get many letters which are the salutation is "Dear BMJ." That does happen, and we recognise the fact that and I'm not precious about that particularly, because I recognise the fact that people do try other journals before they come to us, but that can annoy some editors. I'm not too bad on that. And some editors get a little bit, and I'm again not particularly one of these, they get a little bit grumpy about the dear editor. And actually, I think that the cover letter is a chance to demonstrate that you understand a little bit, if you're going to do it, a little bit understand about, the BJGP, and the BJGP's, what kind of research the BJGP publishes, and that you're a good fit. If you don't know the name of the editor, or that's probably a sign, or you get it wrong, or you send it to Dear BMJ, that's probably a sign that actually maybe you don't know the journal as well as one might hope. So there is a possibility you can sandbag yourself just a little bit. If in doubt, I would say don't spend too much time on it, and concentrate on the paper more than anything, and make sure the essential paper information is in the paper, and then we'll work it out from there.
That's great, thank you. So another question was about referees. If we recommend referees, do you use them? Should they be always from academia, or what about the use of lay experts as referees? So lots of in that. Sorry.
No, that's right. I quite like getting recommendations. I don't have it. But we don't always follow them, I think is the short answer. It's been a bit of a controversial area in the past, because there's been some demonstrable research fraud associated with recommended referees. And again, this was a well-publicized problem, and I'm not picking on Biomed Central, because I had a very good time when I was an editor of Biomed Central, but Biomed Central definitely had this a number of years ago, in fact, when I was editing there, and they banned recommended referees at one stage for a period. And I think our view editorially is that we just treat them with caution. Actually, normally the recommended ones are people we know anyway, by and large subject area experts, and we're fortunate to have a very good kind of peer review database, I think, with keen reviewers who provide us with very good quality peer review. And that's been cultivated over many years by the editors that have come before me. I've no problem with them being outside of academia. I think we frequently get peer reviews from experienced GPs who've got appropriate expertise. And I think, again, scholarly is the word there that I would use. We want good critical reviews that point out the strengths, point out the limitations, and give us that information. And similarly, we don't have a policy of routinely sending to lay people at the moment. That's something we could consider. We certainly obviously encourage it in terms of when the papers are submitted, and it's always regarded as a strength. But yeah, I'm very open to that as well. So I don't necessarily, subject area experts in that regard, or people with lived experience, tremendously useful. So yeah, I'm very willing to be pointed in those directions as well. So it's all extremely helpful.
That's great, thank you. So there's a question from Lucy. Lucy, are you here? Do you want to ask your question?
It's Lucy, no, I can read it at the moment. Is that
okay?
Lucy,
I'll read it out to you.
Yeah.
Oh no, Lucy's here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your insight so far with regards to the publication. My question was actually with reference to when we deposit our presentations into a repository and be able to generate a digital object identifier. I wanted to know, because when you publish a journal article, you're also able to submit an abstract with the full article, is this something that you need to disclose to the reviewers, or it's something that, although you have published your abstract before through a conference presentation, once you publish the journal article, it can be something that is maybe accepted by nature, or is it something you have to disclose your statement to the journal? Thank you.
The short answer is I'm not sure exactly how we marry up the DOIs in those circumstances, or whether we do marry up the DOIs. As if your article got published with us, whether we then link the DOIs together. And I'd have to ask our journal manager if that's the case. My general view is, if you're uncertain, it's better to disclose. It doesn't, a publication of an abstract is not going, in those circumstances at a conference, is not going to prejudice your paper. Certainly going through BJGP, that wouldn't represent a problem. We understand that, at preliminary findings, or before they get submitted to journals, the findings get presented at conferences, and that often results in abstracts. And we would do it ourselves when, research has been presented at the BJGP conference, then we create abstracts and they have DOIs associated with them. So yeah, I would generally disclose it. And so that gives us an opportunity to, reviewers are often, and the associate editors and myself may wish to look at the initial abstract as well for information. But it doesn't prejudice the article. I would genuinely encourage you to do it so we know exactly, just so we understand. I don't think it, I honestly don't know if we actually, because there's a process with, preprints, of course, of linking up the DOIs and them ending up kind of being streamlined together, so that actually, if you publish something on a preprint server initially, this is not quite the same situation. So, but I appreciate that your question wasn't about what happens to the DOIs anyway, but I would say that I would encourage you, I would generally say to tell us, but it doesn't prejudice, it doesn't create a problem for your paper.
Thank you very much. And then we've got a question from Katie Nagel. Do you want to ask your question, Katie?
Oh, hi, it's just a quick one. Just a query about, in our writing, how much we assume the reader is familiar with British general practice, or how much are we writing for an international audience? Do we need to provide glossaries about what a GP, STR, ST3 is, or, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that again, this is a really, actually, it's a quick question, but it's actually extremely complicated answer, I think. Because there is a whole question about how international we are at BJGP in some ways. Now, of course, we publish research from, particularly from Britain, and I think about sort of 60-70% works out as the UK, but we're very keen to publish research from around the world, but usually we tend to prioritize research which is in general practice systems, where general practice systems are similar to ours or dissimilar to ours. So they're across parts of Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand being the sort of the classic examples. And we definitely do see significant numbers of articles read by those regions in particular. So I'm not sure we've gone as far as full-on glossaries, but we certainly would encourage the writing to be understandable for an international audience generally. And we are, although we're called the British Journal of General Practice, I think it is the case that we are keen to make sure that research does, we know it gets downloaded and read across the world. So yeah, if we get too into the, as you say, we can get very lost in the minutiae of detail of British practice. I would encourage you to try to bear that in mind. Normally we will, the one thing I would point out about the BJGP is, and I mentioned this about the outsourcing earlier, is that we have an internal team who do the who do all of the sub editing and the copy editing, and they are extremely strong on stuff like this when we get to the final stages. And I know that we've actually had one or two people who've been slightly horrified at the number of corrections and queries that we've sent back to them in the past, because we really look at this quite hard. And that's the kind of thing that if we think we're getting it horribly wrong, you'll be guided with. We'll try and get it right at the peer review and the editor stage. We'd encourage you to write so that anybody could read it, but we will also give the papers a really thorough, incredibly thorough, kind of gold standard edit and copy edit to get them up to the standard, to get them at that right level as well at the end. So this kind of thing can get smoothed out all the way through the process.
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, Euan. This is a question: if you've got through the past the desk rejects and the paper's been reviewed and you're trying to respond to those reviewers' comments, but you genuinely cannot address the reviewers' comments and keep within the word limit, What do we do?
Okay, so this is always, I always have good fun with this in some ways. And myself and Roger, when I was deputy editor, certainly when it came to opinion articles, used to take it as a personal challenge if an author said, certainly for certain article types, that they couldn't reduce the word count, because we were fairly confident we could look at them and strip back. We felt that we could write it tight, we could edit it down to a tighter level if necessary. So part of me thinks that actually there almost always can be ways to reduce word counts and get it right. And as I was mentioning just before, they're not free in many ways. I know it gets published online and we don't print the full papers in the journal, so it's not like there's paper copies going out, but they do have to be copy edited and sub edited. So there is a kind of a cost associated with articles. So we're keen to keep to the word count. But my final word on this, and the other thing I should add, there are ways to use appendices and supplementary files as well to help on that side of things, of course, too. So not everything needs to be sub-edited. But I do firmly, my final word on this is, my final view on this is that the right length is the one that communicates the science or social science. So I am quite happy to be flexible. If we don't, some papers, particularly mixed methods, you sometimes see have got I've got a lot of, qualitative element and a big quantitative element and a big qualitative element. They do struggle to get in. And actually, rather than seeing those papers chopped up into separate publications, I'm very happy to be accommodating. So I just try and have a conversation with authors about it on these circumstances. I say, my final word is that the right length is the necessary number of words to communicate the science appropriately, because we don't want to get that wrong. That's really the key thing. But it is a bit of a recurring theme with editors, is that we're always telling people to write shorter and cutting words. So that's kind of that, I send dozens of emails every week encouraging people to come in a little bit lower as necessary. The research papers are a little bit different because they don't go into print. It's absolutely essential for the ones that go into print, of course, the word count. There's no scope there. There's almost no scope to, there is a format for the journal. We need articles to fit on a couple of pages or 1 page or 4 pages. And actually, there are a lot of authors who sometimes forget that, with figures and tables, the word count does need to be adjusted accordingly as well. So we do spend a lot of time telling people to cut back, but I'm not into cutting word count just for the sake of it. It has to be, certainly when it comes to the research papers, it has to be right to tell the story.
That's lovely, thank you. Could you just explain to us the relationship between BJGP, BJGP Open, BJGP Life, and that the sort of virtual versus the, well, I was going to say paper, but the journals?
So we have BJGP, the main journal, at bjgp.org. That's the one which was originally the Journal of the Royal College of GPs, and then started life as some research kind of newsletter type thing, and is the original one and has existed since the beginning. A number of years ago, BJGP Open was created, and BJGP Open is an online open access journal. So before BJGP became fully open access, and we are fully open access as well on our research at BJGP now, that only happened in January of this year, BJGP Open was created. And part of the reason BJGP Open was created was because of all these papers we were turning away that we thought were decent quality, perhaps had more of an international, sometimes it was an international area that was replicating stuff that had already happened in the UK, still highly publishable. And so we created this, sometimes has been known in the past as a Cascade journal, to provide a BJGP branded journal for that research to be published in. And so BJGP Open is edited by Dr. Hajira Damba-Miller, and is editorially separate from us completely. So they've got their own editorial team, they've got their own editorial board, and we have conversations about BJGP in general, the brand, and kind of what we're doing together and streamlining our editorial processes when they cross over, but they're 2 separate journals. BJGP Life then is a website, bjgplife.com, and we publish there really opinion and comment and lots of multimedia stuff that otherwise doesn't fit at bjgp.org. And particularly now, what used to be known as for the slightly longer of tooth, what used to be known as the back pages in the BJGP, and it still exists, of course, as BJGP Life and Times. We publish all of our opinion and viewpoints online first, and then we select from there for the print journal. And at the moment, the print journal still goes out. It's a membership benefit to all RCGP members, but you have to opt in for it. And that's been the case for most of this year now. So if you don't get a print BJGP and you're wondering where it's gone, it's because you've not opted in. You can just need to go to your My RCGP page and you can get sent the BJGP. And we publish the editorials there. We publish this. It's basically, if you go at bjgp.org and you look at the issue page, what you see on there is what gets published in. That's the exact replica of what gets published in BJGP print journal, and the hard copy lands on your doormat.
Sorry, Cardinal Sin being on mute again. So thank you very much, Euan. Does anybody else have any final questions for Euan? So I've got one last question that's often asked by early career researchers, early career clinical academics. I've got no money to make it open access. What can I do?
Yeah, that is a challenging one. And because we now do ask for article processing fees. Now, I won't launch into the whole explanation around medical journals and the way things are going. And there's something called Plan S, which is really our hand was forced a little bit to go open access in terms of the model. What I would say is that there are a surprising number of places you can get funding for the article processing charges. And the other thing I would say, and we can provide that information if you ask for it. Actually, Biomed Central have got a brilliant page which has got all the resources and actually your individual university and all the resources within your university. And we often point people towards that because the Biomed Central page is excellent. And you'd be surprised how many pots of money there are at your own university to use for this. And I think we are, certainly at BJGP, we're high enough impact that actually if you get accepted for publication at BJGP, generally the university will manage to find the money for that. So don't be, not to be dissuaded. There are two things you should consider, a couple of things you should consider. You should certainly look at, we have something called a transitional agreement. And that's not quite the right phrase, and I've forgotten what the right phrase is now. Anyway, we have these arrangements where basically it's a cost neutral venture where if your library pays for a small fee, you can then publish unlimited numbers of open access in the BJGP and BJGP Open. Transformational agreement. Thank you. Sorry, that went from my head completely. So we have a transformational agreement. Your library may already have one of those, but they're actually tremendously good value, but it's a little bit complicated getting it organized. And so there are usually lots of ways to find the fees, actually, and we're very happy to advise you. But the most important thing I need to say is I'm generally not involved in those discussions, and the editorial team are not involved in those discussions. So whether you can pay or not is not a factor in whether we accept you to the BJGP. And we've been trying to be very careful. We've not managed complete separation just because we're quite a small organization, and I have to be involved in some of the conversations, but more or less, we try to, church and state, the money and the editorial processes have been separated, so that it doesn't affect whether or not you can pay. We encourage you not to mention it in the letter, the covering letter, so that we don't know about it. We're not even told, and there's a separate channel that you can communicate with our head of publishing to speak to about it. If at the end of it there's no money, then we'll probably there's ways that there is a possibility of waivers, but we've almost never had to go there because there's almost always a way to find the money in the end for it. So in fact, we thought this would be much more of a concern, but it hasn't been. I see Umesh's comment there. Yeah, academics are not based at university for publication fees. The fact is that actually it almost never happens. In fact, it is the short answer. And if it does happen, we'll go through the processes, see if there's any way we can find the money, and we want it to be accepted, then we'd offer a waiver. Is almost certainly what would happen in the end. But actually, since January, it's still not occurred, that situation. So I think it does reflect the fact it is actually, we are relatively difficult. Well, thanks, Joanne. I've seen you put the link as well. It is relatively difficult we do have to be selective, and sometimes that research, it just hasn't made it through so much. It may be more of a problem at BJGP Open with that, but again, they by and large, the fees are less at BJGP Open, and there are often ways around it. But I appreciate it's a difficult situation, and people do worry about it, but by and large, it's worked okay.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Euan. And that brings us to the end of this session. So we're going to stop the recording now. thank you, Euan, for spending the time, for opening back the curtain. Yeah, really, really appreciate that. So thanks for your time. Okay, so we're going to close the conference now, but there's some very important thank yous and announcements